Hi everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Decoding HR Software Costs, Understanding the True Value of Your Investment, with our hosts Phil Sargent and Dan Misen. Please ask any questions throughout using Ask the Speaker panel, and we'll look at these at the end. Thank you, and I'll now pass it over to Phil and Dan.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Sarah. Hi, Dan.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so people are starting to come in, which is fantastic. Let's get going, shall we?
Let's do it.
Amazing. All right, cool. So welcome everybody. As Sandra said, you're here for Decoding HR Software Costs and Understanding the True Value of Your Investment. So realistically, could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So what did you sign up for? Why are we actually here? Well, we are here to talk to you because in around 80% of the cases that we deal with and that we come across, budget is really hard to obtain. Or from some research doing, we see time and time again that business cases do struggle to get the sign-off that we know is needed. So what we're going to try and convey today, Dan and I, is how to secure that budget, how to win board sign-off and get that business outcome that you know you need. What gives us the right to do this? Just by way of short introduction, so we've got Dan Misen here. Dan has 15 years HR software industry experience, and more importantly, thousands of successful projects under his belt. So, when we look at people that can really articulate how to build these business cases and get success, Dan's definitely a good candidate for that. So say hi, Dan.
Hello, I can't believe it's been 15 years. Time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely. And for myself, so I've been in the HR software industry now for about 18 years, which is scary for sure. So I've got loads of experience in direct sales, working with businesses to secure new solutions and in building go-to-market strategies. We both work for the Access People division, and we're both involved in digital sales, which is our area that focuses on the small to medium-sized businesses, so sort of sub 500. But this session's for everyone. We want to make that really clear. And while we're not, even though I don't really understand this expression, but while we're not trying to teach people to suck eggs, hopefully some of these methodologies will help you in time. So let's take a second generally to regroup and understand the baseline. Why is it so hard? Well, from some research through Unleash.ai, we've seen 84% of respondents, so they surveyed 1,000 companies, 84% of those claimed their HR projects were unsuccessful. And that's a really scary statistic for people like Dan and I, who are so invested in making these HR projects successful. And some of the reasons behind that are things like only 22% thought that their project adhered to the budget, only 16% considered their HR tech investments a success, only 19% said that their projects met the timelines that they were working to, and only 11% believed they improved the employee experience. Again, some really scary stats when we think we're doing a great job, and these are some of the results that independent parties are putting out. Dan, from your perspective, what percentage of discussions are you having on a regular basis that you would say slowed down, disappeared, or just didn't get budget sign-off?
Yeah, I'd say it can be up to around 50% realistically. And yeah, I guess really the main reason for that is, there's a number of reasons, but I'd say if you're looking at probably the main two, I'd say it could either be because just things have happened, such as maybe an auto renew. So it's always one of those things to kind of be prepared for in terms of you're looking to change provider. You think, we'll give notice later. Then all of a sudden you're in another year or 3 years or whatever it could be. And that can then stop a conversation dead right there. But then also it can be a case of process as well, of actually understanding, well, what is this process? Is it a case that I can just go out, have a look at a few things and then make a decision? But actually, in reality, usually with all of these kind of processes, there's a quite stringent methodology within your own businesses in terms of these steps you need to go through. So again, that could be something that can either, again, stop a project or certainly slow it down quite significantly as well. So I'd say in terms of projects maybe not happening as initially thought when starting it, those two are probably the things that I come across most frequently.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So it says how the project has been constructed largely and its adherence to process, right? And yeah, there's always a clause in there somewhere that tries to hold people to account, and really understanding that is important, like you say. And it's a little bit sad to hear these stats and see these realities, because the conversations always start with so much earnest. There's frustrations out there to be tackled. So we're going to start to target this from the ground up, and then hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have some good templates that you can use to leverage so that you can turn these frustrations into really quantifiable factors, influences, problems, and you can really start to compare the impact of making change. So just to recalibrate again, so reducing risk is a typical frustration that we hear. I want to get better visibility over my data. I want it in a more controlled fashion. I want the assurance that it's compliant. And then if we look at other factors, so saving time, everyone is keen to save time. In fact, our motto is freedom to do more here at Access, right? So we know that saving time is critical. Do more stuff that you love to do and that you want to be doing in your roles. Modernizing for both the employee experience, but also how the systems share data into each other, and then also give richer management information out of the back end, and reducing vulnerabilities and capacity issues. Again, particularly in the small to medium sized business segment, so much of this is underpinned by one or two key persons within an organization. And these frustrations can be quantified really, really easily. And it's interesting, we use a methodology in our team and in our operation called SPIN, which we'll come on to in a second. And we really wanted to share the benefit of that with the attendees to this session. So what's SPIN all about? So it consists of 4 components: the situation, the problem, the implied need, and then the need payoff. So for us, the situation are those frustrations that we've just had. So I want to save time, right? The problem of that is where we start to quantify the time saving. So being able to say, okay, well, right now I spend X amount of hours on a task I know is just administration or repetitive, something that I can outsource, right? So we can start to quantify that based on the salaries of the people involved, or just generally the amount of time is taken. And then that creates that implied need. So that would suggest to people like Dan and I that the need there is to reduce the amount of time spent. That becomes the need. So finding ways to reduce time should then technically create the need payoff, which is we can save you X amount of time, which equals this amount in cold hard pounds, dollars, euros, whatever you guys are using today. So that's how we build the layers of taking the situation down, both a quantifiable problem and also a needs payoff. Dan, which of these do you think your customers struggle to get to the most? When we think about quantifying the frustrations that they'll call you for.
So yeah, I think when anyone that I've really come across typically enters into the process, usually the first 2 are very much where their kind of mindset is at. It's in terms of, okay, this is our current situation and I'm feeling this challenge, this pain here. And then it's a case of what we're trying to do in our team here is basically surface out, well, what does that actually result in? What the kind of things that has an impact on that we can maybe really help with in terms of a long-term strategy there. And again, it's just kind of almost looking at it again in terms of the previous slide, in terms of why fix something when you are going up to MDs, FDs, all these kind of things. And it is that case of sometimes you can be so close to it that you've been facing these same pains, these same challenges for so long that in so many people's minds, that's no longer a challenge. It's just the way it is. And a lot of people don't realize actually it can be a lot better. These are actually things that maybe are putting hurdles in the way where they don't have to necessarily be there. And again, it's a case of, well, what is that challenge really then resulting in? Because it maybe, yeah, we lose time. So, okay, but what does that time result in? So, yeah, absolutely. From a return on investment, that time equates to money. And every hour saved is money saved. But it's also a case of what could that time be used for? I think that's when we start getting into that needs payoff in terms of what is this going to result in. So yeah, return on investment in terms of time saved, but what can we do with that time? And in my experience, some of that is just a case of actually using the time to innovate a little bit more. So rather than just doing the admin task and being swamped in that, it's a case of thinking about, well, actually, let's create a structured performance process. Let's create a career pathway to actually give some milestones, some goals for our staff. Or if we do have some maybe disengaged staff, how can we recognise that and put them on the right path? And again, it's a case of what do these things then lead to? And typically, it'll be a case of actually getting your staff to be more engaged, but also then to effectively hit better KPIs. So, for example, maybe someone's hitting 500 support queries resolved. Well, actually, create a career pathway, the performance process, so it's more confident and effectively more skilled in that space. Now we're doing 750 support queries resolved. So it's a case of innovating to get performance up and get more engagement from staff. And again, that's what we're trying to surface with. This is a case of, this is the pain, but what implications does that have and how improve things?
Thanks, Dan. I'm really sorry to say, I think some of that broke up a little bit. I'm not entirely sure whether that's internet connection or the site, so sorry about that. But I think if I've heard you correctly, and from some of the discussions we've had leading up to this, what you're saying there is these frustrations that people are having become so much of the norm that they actually don't realise that they can be solved, and more importantly, that they can't be quantified, right? And so we take it for granted that somebody's just going to pick this up and somebody's going to deal with this. But the way we look at the situation is we like to really put it apart to identify where that total cost of the current state is actually causing problems. So to Dan's point, if we go back to that puzzle diagram and we start to think about how do we quantify some of these situations into actual total cost of ownership, we can look at things like, in reducing risk, we know that the risk of non-compliance equates to about 2 to 4% of global revenue for a company in fines should the worst thing happen, right? That's a massive risk to have on your shoulders if you have a concern that your solutions or the way that the solutions are put together, it is a risk, in data integrity. In saving time, the average UK HR manager salary is now at 47 grand a year. That equates to about £23 an hour. If you could save just 50% of the time that you're doing some unnecessary admin work or some additional steps in a process because there's manual intervention, it all starts to add up. If we look at increasing capacity, well, we know for a fact that if there's a risk, single person dependency, and that person was to leave, win the lottery, rightly so, not turn up to work the next day, all of a sudden you've got to react to that, and that's an unbudgeted expense. Most organizations will have, tolerances there, but that can quickly grow out of control, especially when you need to start looking at solutions quickly. A lot of vendors may take advantage of that as well, and you can't rush these decisions. And then finally, modernizing, right? Both from an employee experience point of view, so the cost of attraction, retention, development, but then also the cost of things like integrations, customizations, maintenance of that, it really can start to add up. And so these component parts become the total cost of ownership, and they're split out into two key factors. First of all, the direct total cost of ownership. That comes from typically the cost of the solutions that are already in place. And what we've done here is we've brought together your basic ecosystem that we see most organizations out there have today, small, medium, or large, right? An applicant tracking, some screening for risky roles, a HR management system with some payroll management and on either included or in collaboration of, some performance management to make sure you're getting the best out of people and that you can develop effectively, and then obviously the reward and benefits on the outside. So we've put this slide together using some average figures from within the market here. And Dan, would you say there was anything missing or anything that you'd add to that?
I think it could always be a case that some of these things can even have a knock-on effect to other areas. So, for example, with performance management, it could be that could lead to is maybe some learning content could really, again, enhance some of that performance in terms of recognizing where improvements can be made and actually giving some content to help with that. But I think also with just what's on the screen here, it's a case of sometimes this can cross over from person to person. So again, why it's so important to make sure that you're involving a wider team, because it could well be that, for example, for yourselves, you're looking at it in terms of, I need a HR management system. What if someone's working on the recruitment side of things, actually they're having some troubles themselves, or someone on the payroll side, which is why I find that it's so important to get everyone involved, because there could be so many pieces of this puzzle that create so much savings across the board. And again, it's that integration. It's a case of, rather than having a tool over here, a tool over there, somewhere else, having it in one place. And again, it's a case of making it, again, that integration challenge, which is certainly something that we like to solve for our customers as much as we can.
Do you know what? That's one of the things I adore about you, Dan, is you're always looking to involve as many people as you possibly can in your projects. And I will say that's one of the reasons you are so successful in what you do, is because you're always looking at the bigger picture. And I think I've seen it time and time again, the way that, say, a primary point of contact, like HR manager's got in touch with you and said, I really need to change my HR system. It's just not working out for me or my employees. And the way you've expanded that into other areas of the business and said, well, there's a project going on in recruitment, payroll is coming up for renewal. And I love the way you always bring members of organizations together to a shared goal. And it's exactly as you said, it's really important when you're analyzing the direct total cost of ownership. So yeah, especially things like learning, development, the content that you're serving up to your employees can also be included in that ecosystem as well. So great points. But then we also need to look at the indirect costs. And I'm going to use those puzzle pieces again to sort of reference some of that, because the indirect costs relate to things that are sometimes completely out of your control, and sometimes even harder to quantify. Now, we've already talked about the time-saving element, risk exposure. If we use a typical profile of, say, a £20 million organization, that could, at 2 to 4%, work out with a bit of quick maths, to about 800 grand in potential fines, or, at over 100 employees, it's £8,000 of risk that you carry in just trying to manage this internally, right? Capacity vulnerability, consultancy is about £700 a day these days, and try to bring someone quickly in to help fix a solution is definitely an unbudgeted cost that you need to be aware of. And then modernization, we typically look at things like the integration and customization costs. And we did a recent poll on LinkedIn, actually, and that was the number one concern people have when they're considering HR software costs, is how much is this thing going to cost to include it in our overarching stack, right? So being able to work with vendors or work with solutions that include those integration and customization costs is really important for making sure that you don't sort of see this grow arms and legs and become quite an uncontrollable cost. And so these would be some of the indirect costs that we would look to analyze with our prospective customers. Regardless of size, they're all there, right? And that can really help us build a more rounded picture. So what are the options, right? So we're starting to really get our head around how we understand the total cost of ownership, both direct and indirect, and we kind of know the reasons why we're looking at this. Well, we see three key options, right? Number one, I could build a solution. I could build a way out of it. There's often a lot of great resource within an organization these days, especially in IT and HR systems teams, that can really start to look at building ways through it. It does take a lot of people power, but it can be done, right? It's the cost of maintaining that and that assurance around risk protection that we see as some of the shortcomings. You can buy your way out of it, right? So you can go and find a solution that caters for a lot of these direct and indirect costs out in the market. It usually gives customers a little bit more confidence that it's proven, it's tried, it's tested, it is effective at solving these issues. But of course, you got to, and it helps you to hold someone else accountable to that delivery. But then you got to work through, overexcited salespeople. You've got to make sure that it's proven. All that kind of good stuff needs to go into it. Or you can borrow elements of other solutions that you've got in place. Now, the cost implications of that are really great at the front end. You've already got the systems in place. Maybe that time and attendance tool has some good HR functionality in it, or the payroll does. You can start to look at maybe compromising to save a bit of cost. But time and time again, we do see customers come back to us and say, kind of only worked for a year. We've grown a bunch now, or our objectives have changed, and we need to revisit the conversation. And that's fine, right? Because you've been able to weather the storm for a period of time, but it hasn't necessarily solved those frustrations that we see. So what we're going to do for the purposes of this session and this example is we're going to have a look at the practicalities of buying a solution to overcome those total costs of ownership. Now, inevitably, there's some key areas to focus on. What are the options, right? We need time to analyze the need, as we've discussed, to reduce the number of options we consider. We, Dan and I and the team, do see lots of strange combinations of options coming together. And I think largely that comes from just a lack of knowingness about what you're really looking for. But you rely on folks like us to help guide you through that, right? So don't take everything that you see online as verbatim, right? The proof often comes from being able to speak to reference customers, being able to talk in forum groups around preferred options. You can get lots of really relevant and really up-to-date insights from those channels. The ease. So, one of the things we always do struggle with a little bit is understanding a customer's real timelines and resource availability to get these projects underway. So when we're thinking about the pros of buying a solution, you've got to make sure you know what options you need to consider, that there is proof, and that you do have the resource availability and the timeline to be able to deploy it. Looking at some of the cons around buying a solution. So as Dan keeps calling out, engaging internal stakeholders as early as possible and giving them good justifications as to why this is going on is critical. We would always advocate a real review on the terms and conditions, because as Dan pointed out earlier, getting stung down the process because you've just renewed a certain area or against an existing contract without knowing is really important. And then, making sure that budget gets signed off. Again, we keep coming back to that being one of the hardest parts of making this stuff a success. So, having the right methodology in place to get that confidence of the board or at the people that own the budgets is really important. Just quickly, Dan, is there anything else that you'd add to that? And then we'll have how we can start to piece some of this together.
Yeah, so again, just looking at it in terms of obviously the three options that you do have there, in terms of the borrow, build, buy. In my experience, what I've found with the borrow and the build is more delaying it. Is a case of actually just kind of maybe coming up with a solution that could last for another year at best before you start to see more creaks in it, and you think, okay, now do we do more borrowing, more building, or do we start the buying cycle where we could have maybe done that a year ago? So it is a case of having to maybe get staff trained up on something new just to have to change that again in a year's time, which can cause more delays. So a lot of the time I do find that certainly if things aren't working, that actually getting something that's purpose made for it is the best solution. And a lot of the time people could say, oh, sales, that's a con. But it's, in our mind, certainly at Access, that's not the way that we look at it. In terms of actually engaging with the salesperson from our point of view and the way that we like to take it on, is that it's a plus. It's like getting a travel agent there to help you with booking your holiday. It's a case that you're getting an experienced individual that can help you through that process. So effectively what we want to do is be able to build a project plan. So we can actually highlight, well, these are some of the steps that we usually come across. Does this look the same on your side? Let's get them engaged, or as well as building a return on investment. So again, these are the kind of savings that we've seen with all the projects that we've had in the past. Does this resonate with yourselves? Let's start building a pack. So again, it's a case of what we want to do is actually help justify why actually buying is the right option and equip you with that. So that's what I've kind of seen in my time there.
Awesome. Okay, great. And I think we're at that point now where hopefully around the table, people are nodding their heads going, yeah, I've been confronted with some of these challenges in previous projects, or I've tried stuff and it hasn't worked. Or hopefully by this point, we've got that sort of relatability that, everything that we're trying to drive towards here is how do we help identify total cost of ownership, and then we're going to have a look at some of the templates that we use and that we apply that hopefully we can share with you for some inspiration. So first of all is starting to compile the list of total cost of ownership, both on the current state and the projected state. So we've pulled together an example here. Like I said, typical profile that we've worked with, 100 employee company, £20 million in revenue, HR manager, an integrated HR and payroll solution, but other parts sort of separate, and spending about 15 hours a week on manual tasks. And we typically talk about this stuff in the very first conversation that we're having. Now, we've used those sort of industry averages for the current total cost of ownership. And of course, we appreciate everyone's going to be different here, but the direct costs would equate to around about £41,500 a year, right? So it's quite a lot. And you might only in your role see a component part of that, but this is the extent to which it can grow. And then we've used some guidance on the indirect costs, but we're not going to focus so much on those for the purposes of this example. Then we have a look at projected total cost of ownership. Not going to go into any sort of shameless plug here. That's specifically what we're not about. We're just looking at this from examples. But if we did use the Access People suite that we can offer now, there's lots of ways within which we can integrate that. It all comes within one platform, which is a massive help, right? And a lot of these component parts, of the same solution, right? They're just apps within a platform. So, using our own example, the total cost of those direct factors would equate to about 17,500 for exactly the same, profile, scope, grade of solutions, just to be really clear. So then how do we actually start to build? So we can see that there's a saving in that total cost of ownership. Fantastic, great, round of applause. But as always, getting the access to the budget comes from, can you highlight the return on investment? Now, a simple return on investment calculation looks like this. Okay, step one is calculate the very first year's return on investment. You do that by taking the final value, which is actually the gap between the current total cost of ownership and the projected total cost of ownership. So that creates a value. And then you minus that from the initial investment. So initial investment will always include, or typically include, should I say, a setup cost and some training costs. So it is a little bit higher sometimes in the first year than years 2, 3, whatever the term needs to be. You divide that again by the initial investment, and that will give you a year one return on investment. You can do the same formula for years 2, 3, whatever. All right. And that's the annual value that you see as the saving from the what was, and then minus away the annual investment. And obviously, the aim there is to reduce the amount of sort of setup, training, customization, consultancy fees that come with it. Not always, but that gives you a rough outline on the formula. Then if you can combine that and show over a number of years the return on investment gained, you're in a really, really strong place. So let's apply it to our working example. Okay, so the final value for us based on those total cost of ownerships would be 41,400 minus the 17,800. So a final value of 23,600 saved. The initial investment in the case that we've presented there would be the package, 17,800, plus £2,000 is our typical sort of setup and training for that stack. So a total initial investment of 19,800. You take the 19,800 away from the 23,600 and divide that again by the investment of 19,800. That gives you an ROI number of 0.19. You can multiply that by 100 to give you a percentage. So 19% year one return on investment. For a point of reference, anything positive is good. 5 to 10% is typically where people will sign off on a budget, where they can see 5 to 10% return on investment. This figure here at 20% is eyebrow liftingly exciting, right? You'll see a lot of finance directors nod and suddenly go, cool, tell me more, I'm into this, right? And that's how we use this formula to create a really tangible return on investment. That becomes the need payoff in our spin methodology. So you've got to the point of the quantifiable problem. Now you've got a need payoff. And a really great way we present this is something like this, right? So this is a template that we use in our sales process and talking with our customers. You'll see there that the red boxes are both the direct total cost of ownership components and the risks identified. Usually evokes a bit of a conversation. And then what we've done is we've added the ROI over time. So typically our agreements last 3 years. So we've shown the incremental return on investments as percentages and also highlighted the savings. Now you could do something very similar to this, really, really easy based on the templates that we've shown today. And then adding in the investment asks, you're kind of reinforcing that. So everything all on one page, really easy to present, socialize with other stakeholders and get that buy-in that you're looking for. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is it. I think this is the kind of thing that, again, what we want to do is just help equip you with all of this kind of information as best as possible, really. So again, that's where, as you say, going back to the spin, that's where we can find this out, and then we go on that process to effectively give you something like this at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And as part of the process that we run here, and I'm sure many other providers do the same sort of thing, but it's all about kind of working with you to uncover those costs and get to that return on investment. That's our job. We're here to help you build this stuff. So, if anyone out there wants help in pulling this stuff together and analyzing in this way, then please absolutely get in touch, and we'll share with you an email to get in touch with us following this session. But let's come back full circle now and have a look at some of the critical takeaways that we hope you've picked up in this session. Number one, we recognize that companies, HR, people teams out there, all sorts of associated teams out there are not getting the support in pursuing the upgrades to their frustrations, to overcome those frustrations, right? Or that they're experiencing a lack of success in the transformation projects that they're trying. And it comes down all of the time to the work that's being done up front. Just reacting to a scenario is not a tangible and sustainable way to ask for investment. We have to build up this kind of structure. And that comes with quantifying and understanding all the factors influencing the total cost of ownership. And in understanding that, it helps you build greater control and identifying the return on investment. The most successful projects we see go through that flow. So then the total cost of ownership, just as a reminder, includes both direct and indirect costs. Often we're left working with just the direct ones, the really tangible ones, but it's so important to look around that into the wider organization and ecosystem to understand the impact of some of those indirect costs, time saving, vulnerabilities, risk of non-compliance, and of course, modernization in customizations, integrations, things like that. And finally, going back to the point, right? We've pulled this together on the basis of a lot of conversations that we have, and we're passionate about helping everyone to overcome these barriers to change. And if we could just help 1% of the people we deal with on an annual basis, move that needle from Dan's 50% to 49%, that's nearly 100 companies we've helped realize their ambitions, get their budgets signed off, get their objectives complete, and improving their operating environment. And that's what we're passionate about, giving everyone around this table and beyond the freedom to do more of what they love to do and what they're empowered to do within the organization, not just administration and multiplication of tasks. So above all, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We hope passionately that we've been able to offer up some insight that's been meaningful and share some ideas and inspiration for tools that you can use right now in your own organization to really quantify these problems and find the right payoff for the needs that you've uncovered. So now we'll hand it over to some questions. I think we did have one question previously as we came into this from an attendee, and that was around, again, the customization and integration costs, really being able to understand how do I identify those. And so, Dan, you deal with a lot of complex projects, right? People bringing systems together. Would you say there were one or two pieces of advice you would have for a customer who wanted to really understand the cost of customization or integration?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can vary from customer to customer. But so with us, what we want to do is basically find out really again what is the full need of this project. So whenever we're looking at a project, we want to find out what's driving it, but actually what can we do to enhance it. And one of those key things, as you say, is that integration of how is this one piece going to fit into the wider puzzle, which is our whole internal ecosystem. And in an ideal world, obviously, what we'd like to do is have that one-stop shop where again you'd have your HR, your payroll, your ATS all with us at the same time. In reality, sometimes you have agreements elsewhere, which means you can't do it all at once. So what we want to do is effectively make it as easy as possible and certainly cost effective as possible in terms of getting information plugged into other spaces, whether that be via CSV, API, or some ready-made integrations. And effectively, again, in terms of the customization, it's again what is key for you to actually make sure that that you're capturing, and again making sure that you're not only being able to capture that, but adequately report on the kind of necessary information, whether it be key compliance issues like gender pay gap, or just more other things around some of your own internal analysis. So again, it's a case of how much time can be saved with those features in place, but also what kind of efficiencies can we bring out by actually plugging all your tools together as well. And again, when we're drawing up those ROIs, those return on investments, it is a case of, right, well, where can we succeed in getting that time saved? Where can we succeed in getting the information that you need? And again, that needs payoff. The results of doing that time's freed up. what can you do instead? What can we do in terms of maybe improving engagement with staff, improving performance pack with staff? And so again, it's a case of always looking at that, not just the first resolution, but the impacts that can actually have a knock on for.
Amazing. Thanks, Dan. That's a really good answer. So for the folks still around the table with us right now, please get your questions in. We're here. We've got an extra 10, 15 minutes now to answer those for you. If there's anything you'd like to go back to that we've shown here, I know I covered off that calculation quite quickly. So if you want to go and explore that a little bit further with us right now, then please stick around, put your questions in the chat. If you don't have any questions, then obviously thank you again for making the time to be with us today. I've put a little link down at the bottom there. So it's Access People Solutions at the Access Group. If you want to talk privately, one-to-one, just message us, or jump into Dan or I's DMs on LinkedIn. We're always available to help out where we can. Above all, we really hope that you've enjoyed the session. So we'll give it a couple of minutes, probably bring Sandra back in now. Sandra, have you seen any questions come through that we can answer?
Apologies. There's no questions in at the moment, but as you mentioned, Dan, folks are free to reach out to you guys personally on LinkedIn or email in with that link if you've got any questions in the future. But I think with that, Dan and Phil will just say goodbye and thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good day.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.